Welcome everyone to a Semgrep community event. I'm Tanya Jenga, your host and head of community at Semgrep, and I'm here with my friend, but also one of the people who has taught me many, many things in this industry, Adam Shostak. Welcome, Adam.
Hello.
Adam, will you please tell us, so for people that don't know who you are, could you just tell them a little bit about you?
Sure. So I think the thing that I am best known for these days is my work on threat modeling, including 2 books. Along the way, I helped create the CVE. I'm on the review board at Black Hat. I'm an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. There's the short form. And I'm thrilled to be here today. Oh yes, and
Awesome.
Fotis mentions that I have a company, Showstack and Associates, where we help people learn to threat model.
It's true. They do. And someone
Yes,
saying that
Brad,
he,
I helped create the CVE back with Dave and Steve when I was working at a Vuln scanning company in 1997.
yeah, Adam's done a lot of things. What about the CWE, we are being asked?
No, not the CWE. Um, yeah, that was other folks.
Awesome. Okay, so um, everyone, you can ask questions in the chat. You can also use the Q&A feature. I don't know if we're going to let people off mute just because we have so many questions and I want to be able to hear Adam. And I'm worried like we'll all just start talking because I do a lot of talking. And so I know lots of other people do too. Um, but Adam, so us deciding to do a webinar started because I called Adam and was like, hey, you're giving training at the OWASP Global AppSec Conference in DC. And he's like, yeah, I am. And I was like, do you need a volunteer that's named, do you need a volunteer? And he's like, I always need volunteers. I'm like, do you need one named Tanya? And he's like, what? And I really wanted to take his training. And so then you're like, why? I'm like, because I want to know how you threat model, not how I want to know how other people do it. And you do a lot of it, a lot more than I've done. So I want to learn. And I never took a course before on it. So, um, so let's talk about that, Adam. Like, what were your thoughts on that? Having like a person just be like, I want to take your training, even though I've done it a long time.
So, so the thing that's so important about how we learn to threat model is so often it's this apprenticeship model that both you and I went through, right? I learned how to threat model from other folks talking about it as a way of thinking rather than as a structured process. And in when I joined Microsoft in 2006, I I didn't really understand scale, right? I understood threat modeling as this thing that you and I do at a whiteboard,
Mhm.
and they were like, "Oh, yeah, we've got 6,000 developers working on Windows. You can't even do one of our main products, never mind Office, Xbox." And those are just some of the main products that Microsoft ships. And
Mhm.
so I had to learn how to structure it. I had to learn how to teach it. And that's a different thing.
So it is
So so you came along to this course and we had
a great
do you
time.
want to talk a little bit about what happened?
Yeah. So I was basically like, I got Adam coffee, I like got markers, I ran around and put things on walls. I was very helpful.
Okay, you did that, but let's talk about the intellectual content.
Yeah. Um, so like we came up with a pretend system to threat model because everyone's from different companies. So we can't work on a system that we all know. So we had to come up with a pretend system. So Adam gave us a pretend system and we created data flow diagrams, and we talked about like the idea of, well, basically, you're never going to have a perfect data flow diagram. If you spend 10 hours on your data flow diagram, you don't have time to write any threat models. And we talked about how it's never going to be perfect, so you need to calm down about that, because that is a thing that I fret about a lot. And it turns out a lot of people fret about that. Like, if we don't uncover every single threat that ever happens, then, you know, we'll miss one, and then that will obviously be the one that happens, and it'll be the end of the world. So there was a lot of, it's going to be okay, Tanya, calm down. Um, but I found it really, really interesting to work with a bunch of people I don't know. And we switched teams at some points, and we switched looking at different systems. We looked at different people's data flow diagrams so that we could see how they looked at things. We talked about different threats that people found. I found it very interesting to see how other people looked at stuff. I found it very interesting that some teams, you had to shove them, or they were not going to move to the next step. And then there were other teams where they're just flying along, like those French people. I was like, they're going to threat model the whole city. They were amazing. But a lot of it was, oh, this is how other people think about this. And it kind of opened my eyes to a lot more possibilities than I'd realized were there. There's like, I definitely see so many more things now after having so many people explain the way they think about it and how they see those threats.
Yeah, we
Um,
give people this two-pager,
mhm,
and it's fascinating for me to watch when we give them a few minutes instruction on this is a data flow diagram, this is how we start to answer what are we working on, and then we go around the room and we just look because we're doing this on whiteboards, um, and we can see how different the answers are with just a quick little thing. And then as the training goes on, as you said, Tanya, the variance, right? People don't get to precisely the same answers. And that's okay because they're getting some answers. And one of the things that you and I one of the things I thought worked great about that training was as we went around the room and talked about the work we had done,
mhm.
you just picked up a whiteboard marker and started summarizing it. And I thought that was a great tag teaming because me answering the questions live and then you looping back to people,
Mhm.
I just thought it worked really, really nicely.
Me too. And there was the part of your training where you're like, okay, everyone, how would you break into my house? It's like, oh no. And I was really impressed with people's answers. And we talked about the threats to Adam's home and the fixes and mitigations and ways we could avoid having people break into Adam's home. And that was really because everyone has a home. So everyone understands the idea that we don't want people breaking in we want visitors to be able to come and not get bit by dogs or whatever else. But also we want bad people to not get in, and how does that work? And I liked how any person could understand that because most people have a home or have had a home.
The
Um,
the thing that makes that exercise work is the contrast between everyone understands what a home is based on our experience, just lived experience. And then we transition to, hey, this technology is much more abstract. You can't really touch it in the way that you you can touch the doors, the windows, the chimneys, the security cameras, all that jazz. but people get into it. And I think that's one of the things that I really, really want to emphasize about threat modeling is, while we value expertise,
Mhm.
we also really value diverse experience and backgrounds, because everyone's different perspective is they bring something to the table. And if we focus in too much on the high structure variance, stride kill chains, then we send this message that your experience doesn't matter. And if we asked every one of the 234 people on this call to write down 3 threats, and then we assembled them into a list, we'd probably have like 400 unique things in 5 minutes. That would be a fun webinar to do sometime.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, that would actually be really, really cool.
but
As
anyway, go ahead.
So we had some questions in the chat, but then I want to go back to the idea of the apprenticeship model of threat modeling, not threatening. Um, so Ken was saying the biggest struggle for teams and consultants, in my opinion, is figuring out what is the output of the threat model. So there's so much content around how to threat model and find the threats, but I think it's much harder to understand what do we end up with at the end, and then how do we use that thing? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's a fellow, Nick Gerstein, who once asked me, is threat model a noun or a verb? And I just love that question. Um, because what the person was asking in the chat here is threat modeling as a noun. What's the output? And the output can be a data flow diagram. It can be a list of threats. It can be a list of bugs. If you hire consultants to write a threat model for you, they'll give you a long document. And there's also threat modeling as a verb, which is we get together and we talk about the question of what can go wrong. And the thing that happens when we get human beings in a room and they talk about something is it influences what they're going to do next, whether or not there are notes. And if you do take notes, more of what you talk about happens. But a lot of times the benefit of threat modeling is you think about, I don't know, I'm going to cut down all the trees on my property, and then my neighbor's going to be annoyed that they need to go get some curtains, just to pick a random example. um, and we can say, do we care about that? No, we don't owe the neighbor curtains. And we don't need a big, complicated document to figure that out. The conversational, we've thought about this enough, is both great and it's really challenging because organizations like measurable stuff, right? If I'm an executive and my staff comes to me and said, we did a bunch of work, it's all good, I'll be like, can you show me? And so we need to balance these perspectives. We need to take notes so we don't lose track of stuff.
Mm.
And maybe, and this was a point of conversation between you and I, Tanya, about evil brainstorming versus structure.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about your brainstorming perspective?
Yes, so the first time I met Adam, so I gave a talk at B-Sides Vancouver, and it was like, for me, this was a very big opportunity. I was like really excited to speak at this conference, and there was some confusion where I had been told this lady named Terry Radichel or Ridicule, depending upon how you want to say her name, that I was in her room and she was in my room. Um, and it turned out that none of that was true, and just someone played a prank on her and I. So we switched rooms. And then at the beginning of my talk, I'm like, "Hi, I'm Tanya." And all these people are like, "She's not the tall, skinny blonde lady." And so like everyone, like, she's not the cloud hacker. So a whole bunch of people got up and all left. And anyway, so I see Adam come into my room and I'm like, "Oh God, it's the famous threat modeling dude." And I'm going to talk about threat modeling. And I'm like, this is my second talk I've ever given. It's my first talk in like a really big city. I'm just, so then I talk about, so is my talk pushing left like a boss? So I'm briefly like, this is what threat modeling is. It's sort of like evil brainstorming. So you come up with lots of threats, and then you try to figure out what you're going to do about it. Right. And that's how I threat modeled then. It was very unstructured. I learned via the apprenticeship model. I was told, so my apprenticeship included don't invite the technical staff because they don't know anything. Yeah, that they
Wow.
wouldn't be helpful because they don't understand the business. So why bother inviting them? Um, and that you should just ask what keeps you up at night and just solve those things. And I do think that question's still very good. Um, but basically, we just talked to the business owners or product owners, business representatives, whatever you want to call them. And then I was like, decided to invite technical staff because it turns out they know a lot. Um, and the person that taught me wasn't that technical in nature. And then I got more things, but I was very unstructured. And that was part of my excitement of going to see Adam talk. And so he was like, "Is it really evil brainstorming or is it actually a lot more?" And I'm like, "Maybe."
I don't think I asked that question there because
Oh
this
no,
was the
not
first.
there. Years later. Okay,
Yeah,
so to be clear, Adam came up after and said the nicest things ever, and that my talk was so great and it was so nice to meet me. And I was like, but I totally played it cool.
you did. You did. You were
I
awesome.
was I was not cool.
Still are.
And then we became friends and it was awesome.
So unstructured, and Gaurav is asking this question for an example.
Mhm.
Unstructured might be asking what keeps you up at night, right? The answer is totally wide open, right? It may be I'm annoyed at my football team and I'm kept up at night. And
Mhm.
structured might be something like stride or kill chains where we go through and we look for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege because I say those a lot. Um, because we want to make sure that we get coverage. And so the differentiation is one, being totally open-ended will get you things that surprise people and won't come up when you tell them they need to be able to rattle off stride that quickly. And so finding under for me, I think expertise comes when we can talk about not only I threat model like this, but here's tools in a toolbox, and let's talk about the trade-offs between these tools.
Yeah. We like, so when we did the training, we did more than stride, we did kill chains and all sorts of things. And I feel like the structure helps you be thorough. And it nothing's perfect. You're never going to get every single threat because you'll be there for 10 years, but it helps you make sure you get the vast majority. As opposed to if you just say what keeps you up at night, you get one person's opinion. And if that person's really creative, you get a lot of things. And if that person's not, like, to be quite blunt, when I started, my first mentor kept saying, "Take off your developer hat, put on your black hat." Tanya, all you keep doing is trying to solve problems and not break anything. You're going to be a terrible pen tester if you don't become more evil. And it took me quite a while to start seeing the evil side of things. I really had to undo my, don't worry, I'll fix it for you way of working to how could I get around that rule and achieve the thing I'm trying to do. Right. And so I was not good at threat modeling at first. I'd be like, clearly there's no threats. Everything's fine. No one would ever do that.
But, you know, that the self-criticism is both important and damaging, right? We have so many people in the industry who suffer from imposter syndrome. It's okay to not be evil. It's no, if you don't, yeah, just a lot there. I'm not going to dive into all of that, but I do want to say that the relationship between structure and unstructured is just so tension creating for so many people.
Okay.
You can contribute without being evil, and what your mentor was telling you. And we've got so many good questions coming in. I keep pausing because I'm seeing the questions on the side. But when your mentor tells you you're not being evil enough, that is so exclusionary. That is so, oh, well, I guess there's three other people in the room who are saying, oh, I guess I have nothing to contribute here. And it makes me so sad to hear that.
He was not a good mentor. We broke up quite publicly. I don't mention his name for a reason. And then all the other mentors I do name worked out a lot better. Yeah, I refused a job with him because I got offered a better job. And then he badmouthed me until that job offer was rescinded. Yeah, with things that were untrue. It'd be different if those things were true. But so yes, did not work out between me and that person. And so pick your mentors very carefully because you're putting a lot more trust in this person than you might realize. But so we have a lot of good questions. Like one of the questions, so there's so many, it's hard to pick, but one was like, what are the characteristics of a professional threat modeling report? Because I've seen some bad ones. Adam, like I worked somewhere once and we had this guy that kept saying he did threat models. And finally the boss demanded to see the threat models. And it was just some emails. And he would ask them for their design docs and then he would write back, yeah, you're cool. Or he would ask a couple of questions and then he'd be like, I'm satisfied with those answers. You have passed your threat model. And there were like 20 emails for a year. And he said that was his work product. And I was like, okay, so I am cool with a lot of things. I'm not cool with that though. So what would be professional maybe?
I mean, obviously, it's got a logo at the top and the words highly confidential at the bottom. Um, uh, so, so the thing that I think is most important is that the threat modeling report drive action by the people who need to act. And professionalism includes respect, appropriate thoroughness, appropriate timing in terms of deliverability. George Patton said, a great a good plan executed now is better than a great plan executed next month. And so the other thing I will say, and so that I don't, people find this weird. I do not have a template that I use when consulting because I'm focused on what does this customer need. And so if you go to my blog, and you can reach this by going to showstack.org and clicking on the blog thing at the top, and then there's a sidebar. I have a category called Threat Model Thursdays, where I look at threat models that people have published and say, what can we learn from it? And so for me, and people hate this, by the way, and I acknowledge their hatred of it. And the hatred comes from people want an authoritative answer that they can follow. And my answer is, you've got to engage with what's going on around you. And if you just show up with a template, I've worked, and Ayush is asking, how frequently should we threat model? When I worked on Windows, the Windows specification documents for Windows 7 had something like 28 sections, including functionality, programmability, accessibility, maintainability, security, privacy, etc. We threat modeled those once. Other folks, my friend Izar Tarandak says threat model every story. What goes into a threat model when you're threat modeling every story is way smaller than when you're spending a couple of months writing a spec. And so, how frequently should you threat model? All the time, but in a way that makes sense and drives the folks around you to deliver successfully and securely.
I want to add on to that, because so when I started pen testing, I was like, how do I know when my pen test is over? So, and they're like, it's when your consulting contracts run out of hours.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, okay, I do see that. I do see that, right? But when they ask me how many hours it should be, what do I say? And they're like, the biggest number you can say with a straight face. And I'm like, okay, so this is how to make money. Thank you for the, I do want to pay all my bills every month, but like, how do I offer the most value? And so knowing how much threat modeling to do, I would say one of the things you need to look at if you're an employee is, do we have 10 systems or do we have 2,000 systems? Right? Do we have one threat modeler, or do we have a team of 5? Do I have a security champions program where they're going to assist me? So you got to look at, we have this much work. Is it possible for me to, like, if I'm going to do an 80-page threat modeling template, like, which would be ridiculous, just to be clear, then maybe we only have one app we're doing that with. Or maybe we work somewhere and we do have 80 apps, but only one is the one the customers use that has the important data, that has legislation that applies to it. And so we're going to spend 50% of all of our time on that one app. And that's okay, because that's the way our program works. But I think you need to look at that, because sometimes you only have 1 hour and you just need to do the absolute best you can in 1 hour, because that's all you've got.
Yeah. And a lot of people I work with have these things that they call questionnaires, which are designed to help you figure out, quote unquote, if you need to threat model. And I think those questionnaires are threat modeling, right? They're focused on the question of, what are you working on and what can go wrong? And then maybe you go and you do more threat modeling. And I like thinking about those as a spectrum. I always like to think about, what is the value I get for the work product that I'm doing? And, you know, earlier someone was asking about C4 for diagramming, and C4 is context, container, component, something else. And I think about this when I'm delivering training. I've got 16 hours. What am I doing with each of those in 15-minute blocks, literally? to maximize the learning value. And I think C4 is cool, but it's also an hour and a half to 2 hours of training. Thanks, Fotis, for sharing context, containers, components, and code. It's an hour or two of training people in the specifics of how does that work. And if I contrast that hour, let's just call it an hour, with 15 minutes of training on what a DFD is, it's a whiteboard diagram with some specifics, then do I want to spend that time and energy? And I bring this up not to say don't use C4, but to say think about where your energy is going and what's happening. You know, Joe is saying in the chat, we couldn't afford to do it on every app. But as the developers left that team, it helped turn them into champs on other projects. If we, in the same way that when I met Tanya, I told her truthfully she was doing a great job and encouraged her, and now she's spreading that sort of message. I didn't mean to take credit for you, Tanya. You're
I know you're
awesome.
not. No, you're doing great.
Um, but if we encourage people to do a little bit to, and by the way, we have not actually rattled off the 4 questions of threat modeling. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? For asking those questions, we can go up and down in the level of depth. All of that is threat modeling. And if you just get started and encourage people, we get so much value out of it. And Yash was asking, are there non-security aspects you might consider when you threat model, like we might get sued? My question is not what are the threats to the system, it's what can go wrong. And I'm reasonably confident that getting sued is something going wrong, or maybe even layers of things going wrong, right? First, there was a problem, then that problem impacted someone, then they found a lawyer, and then they decided that suing you was the way to deal with what went wrong.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a bunch of questions in the queue. So we have 1 trillion questions in the chat, but we also have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. And one of them, so the first one was like, there's different answers and approaches for this question. How much of the experience of different groups was potentially based on diverse backgrounds and industries? How helpful or hindering is it to have different lenses applied to this threat modeling exercise? And this is something we both feel strongly about. So how is diversity actually important, Adam?
So oh God, this is an hour webinar all in itself. But the short answer is that diversity gives us different answers faster than if we've got people, if we only bring developers or we only bring non-developers into the room. The opportunity to build on one another's answers, and this is where brainstorming and letting a flow of conversation happen is really powerful. It's where write down 3 things on an index card before we get started, or circle of conversation where I say my thing, then Tanya says her thing, then the next person, and we use a structure like a circle of conversation to make sure everyone has a chance to speak up. This is so powerful. You know, the thing I like to think about when I'm thinking about diversity is you're paying for these people to be in the room, and then you're not letting them speak because someone's just yakking away.
Ooh, someone just commented, I think my opinion on diversity is that it doesn't only add range, but it also adds depth. And I like that. Um, so Adam and I both keynoted, so we did a group keynote of many people for Threat Mod Con, which was the first conference ever dedicated only to threat modeling. And it was super fun. And Adam had to do his virtually, which sucked because everyone was like, "Where's Adam? Where's Adam?" Like the entire 2 days. Um, and then he won the Adam Showstack Award for being Adam, which was awesome. But in it, we talked about how threat modeling's for literally everyone, and we need everyone's opinion to get good threat models. And so, yeah, it definitely it goes into that. So there's so many more questions. So another good
Can
question.
I
Yeah,
sorry. Can
yes,
I
please.
just tie this to the question that Udo was asking about is Zartar and Duck's PyTM software?
Yes.
I love the idea of expressing threats in code because code is what the developers are looking at. And when we insist that you must be this tall and know Python in order to contribute, there's a whole bunch of people who are less likely to participate. And so, what I want of all of you is as you mature and grow in your threat modeling practice, being able to be reflective on not this is the Adam anointed method or this is the Tanya anointed method, but here are the pros and cons and the trade offs I'm making about inclusion, about time, about impact. Um, all of those things tie into what's going on.
Oh, Akira just asked the best question ever. Adam, do you
Oh,
have
hi, Akira.
resources like maybe a game or something that could help run threat modeling sessions for large groups of people?
Sure, sure. So back while I was at Microsoft, I created Elevation of Privilege. And Elevation of Privilege Creative Commons license, thanks Microsoft, is a set of cards and they're organized around stride and each card has a hint on it. And I can't read. Oh, I can. I don't have my video mirrored. An attacker can brute force file encryption because there's no defense in place. For example, password stretching. Um, and so you can scale this, and OWASP cornucopia is a variant, and surprisingly, it works really well um, virtually. And this blew me away. I did not think it was going to work in the virtual world. And let me actually get another link here as I'm speaking. Um, but it turns out that my friends at Agile Stationery, who make my card decks, said, hey, let's do this remotely. And so we mailed people the card decks, and it gives people a chance to open it up, be curious about what it is. Then they get their cards out, and we play via Zoom. And it works way better than I would have expected to do this in a distributed world. And you can scale this. We've done this for some very large groups. You bring them together for 90 minutes, you give them a quick intro, you break them out into their breakouts, you remind them two things that are crucial. First, please set aside your skepticism because there's, especially in security, there's someone who wants to explain to you how this is not a good use of time. We don't play games at work. Suspend your skepticism, please. Give it a chance. And then the second thing is remind people that anytime you learn a new game, there's this period of playing with your cards on the table, figuring out what the mechanisms are. And so you do this for every game you've ever played. And so there's this learning period where people are like, what's going on? And that's totally normal. And it happens however much you try and explain it to them until they do it. Um, you don't really get the hang of it.
I'm trying to convince Semgrep to let me make swag called Cards Against AppSec. They're,
So
they're
who did
travel.
that? Someone did Cards Against. I have my little museum of games over here. There's a Cards Against Vintage Security. That's a nice Cards Against Humanity
Oh,
variant.
I have a
Uh,
copy of Cards Against Microsoft that they gave me when I worked at Microsoft.
ooh, I don't
It
have
is,
one of them.
it's pretty, it's Steve Ballmer edition. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, yep. I'm not going to comment on any, those cards are not suitable for work. Um, so we have so many questions, Adam. Did you want to talk about like structure and flow? Did you want to talk about the apprenticeship model? Did you want to talk about the Jenga model? Did you want to talk about threat modeling your mission? Because those were things we had of that we might want to discuss.
So yeah, let me talk for a minute about the Jenga model. And the Jenga model is a thing I created because in conversations that I get into, it's so frequent to see people just get caught up in how many questions we have. And so the Jenga model
Mhm.
is um, you build a Jenga tower, and your blocks are technical skills, organizational skills, and interpersonal skills. So, we've talked a lot about the interpersonal skills in this webinar, but there's also organizational skills. How do we do this here? How do we make where do we store our threat models? Who signs off on them? If there's an escalation, how do we handle it and who gets to decide? And so I'm just going to drop a link to the white papers part of our site in here. And you can see the little Jenga tower that's there. And the idea is you want the tower to be stable, and each block has a cost, so you want to use as few blocks as you can get away with. And so this lets us think about, what technical skills do I need? What training do people need? What's going wrong in the sessions is often people not being inclusive enough. And so the Jenga model is both prescriptive in how do I get going, and analytical in what is this person asking for? How do I think about how to answer some of these questions?
Nice, very nice. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and one that I liked was, how do I sell the idea of threat modeling to people who are like, features first, security is later? How can we maybe try to get some of those people willing to let us do some threat modeling with them?
So there's two things that I like to say. The first is that threat modeling is the measure twice, cut once of cybersecurity. And if you're building something, let's say you're building out of wood, and you cut a beam too short, um, that beam is wasted. If you write some code and that code has a bad authorization model, you're going to rewrite it all. And so code a lot of times is like pouring concrete. And you wouldn't pour concrete without any planning. You need the right amount of planning, right? That the people who are like, it's all features, probably don't believe that security is irrelevant. They believe that the work that you're asking them to do early on isn't valuable enough. And so you need to show them that simply asking what can go wrong is is valuable, that you learn something pretty quickly. This goes back to the 80 page document. If your goal is to get an 80-page document before the sprint can start, well, that is why you fail.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a lot of comments. I'm just going to read some of them out for the recording later. Okay, we can do security later, but your name's going to be associated with this. And if for any reason we get hacked, I'm going to point my finger at you. That might change the tone. Another person commented, I asked them how they feel about bugs and feature functionality. Then I explain a vulnerability is just a bug and it can impact your feature functions. And that's why it's important to find now. Someone else was saying, how can you argue about the cost of doing it later? Because it's sometimes they're like, oh, it costs the same later, but it's actually a lot more expensive later. Like if we look at studies, if you find a bug later in the system development lifecycle, especially once it's out in prod, then you have to get your CI working again. You have to like open up this code, figure out where the heck that problem is. You have to engage QA to do tests. You have to do all this stuff before you can get that fixed versus if the code's already in your face, it's much easier. So I think, yeah. Can we use analogy of shift left for threat modeling? Ooh.
Yes. There's the only definitive single word answer you're getting out of me today, Tanya.
Okay, so we have a few more questions in the Q&A and we have 11 minutes left. So if people want to put their absolute favorite questions in, now is your time. So Ben
So
asked, oh, sorry.
so I wanna go to Stephen's question
Okay.
about what's the best way to organize what's being done in this room. It seemed like it could get chaotic. So there are lots of structures we can use to answer the question, right? The elevation of privilege card deck uses the stride mnemonic, which are a set of threats, and then adds hints to them. There are kill chains, the original Lockheed Martin kill chain, MITRE's attack, which you can use to structure and organize the work. And the balancing act of the people who are saying, my developers don't even want to learn about this, they don't want to do this, even trying to take 15 minutes to teach them about stride at 2 minutes per threat can seem like a waste of time to those people who are saying, I don't want to do this at all. And so this is the balancing act of structure can be great for reducing the chaos, but it can make it harder to get going. So
Oh,
with that, Tanya, go ahead.
no, that is such a great answer.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have so many questions at this point. I'm getting overwhelmed, but um, so can you suggest brainstorming techniques that you use to have people on the mindset and have more effective sessions? And I feel like you answered that with stride and kill chains, but is there anything else to try to get people to open up a bit more and give you their ideas?
So there's a tremendous set of techniques you can use to help people open up. And there's a community which is not a threat modeling community, but they work on what they call liberating structures. And the liberating structures are all about encouraging productive conversation and inclusive conversations in ways that work better. And so I think I think that's the thing that I would go to.
There's actually someone in the audience, my friend Akira, and I met her because she was giving a session on liberating structures, and it was so awesome.
Okay, cool.
And so I'm like, oh, that's so great. Um, okay, so many things here. So someone asks, what are the different roles involved with a threat modeling session? So
Well, so you need some people who are familiar with what the system does or can do, right? So those are frequently developers. You need some people who care about quality, um, the business people, the quality assurance people, and so let me flip this around and ask, why would you exclude someone from this activity? Because I think that's an easier question to answer. And the reason to exclude people is because they break the ability of folks to engage in this work. And that can be saying, we don't care about this, we only want to ship features. It could be, you're not thinking evilly enough, or other judgmental sorts of things. But I think a few minutes on this done regularly is the best pattern that I know of. And all of the how do we do this more effectively are really questions about, how do I make this work in this organization with this VP and their demands, with this development leader who has influence over what's happening, are so crucial. And there's no single this is the way sort of thing. And if you get people chanting this is the way, like in The Mandalorian, you knew I was going to get to a Star Wars eventually. um that's not the way to threat model. That's weird cultism. And there's a lot of weird cultism in Mandalorian. You don't want that. You want to be there, engaged, and looking to, is this helping us deliver more secure systems?
okay, so there's lots of questions, but I'm the host, so I'm going to ask my question. And I have two questions, and the last question is always, what is a key takeaway? And okay, so what is a key takeaway that you want someone to take away from this session, Adam? If they could just remember one thing.
So, the one thing that I want you to remember is the 4 question framework of, what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? If you remember those 4 questions, everything else gets simpler. And if you're getting lost in threat modeling, and you saw me do this, Tanya, when I was training, is I would ask, like, how does that help us answer what can go wrong? And people hate me for it, but they hate me because they have to think about what they're trying to accomplish, and then they get an aha moment.
I, I found like sometimes my team would get off track and we'd be away and you would come back and you'd be like, so how are we answering these questions? I'm like, oh, we're not. You're right. But it was very helpful, like, because then we know where we're going. And so I just put the questions in the chat for everyone. So we still have 3 minutes. So I feel like maybe I could have one more question. When we were preparing for this, I talked about, so we threat model systems one at a time, but a thing I like to do as security champions is threat modeling basically the mission of our organization. Why would we want to do that? Like, what value could that bear for our developers to understand threats to our mission?
So that's a great question. And when I talk about how threat modeling is for everyone, that includes executives and leaders, and the value of asking what could go wrong at a mission level is that instantaneously your answers are connected to the mission, and that drives prioritization of, oh, this threat modeling thing found this, and now I know that this matters to executives. We're going to fix this. But it also shows the value of threat modeling to the execs. And so when there's a question about how much time are we spending on this, they're like, yeah, but remember, it got everyone focused on this thing that no one was spending enough time on because of this disconnect between the technical work and the business work.
Oh, it's such a good answer. That's way better than my answer. Um, that's why I asked, because I wanted to hear your opinion.
Yeah,
Okay, so yes, this has been recorded, and yes, we're going to share the recording with everyone that signed up to come. And yes, I'm of course going to ask Adam to come back, obviously. Everyone's already been asking that in the chat. Um, okay, Adam, so we have to wrap up now, but could you please shamelessly promote yourself? I want you to tell people about your books. I want you to tell people about your training. Could you just please do that for me?
sure, sure. So since 2016, Showstack and Associates has been focused on how do we enable threat modeling. We train, we coach executives, we help people through open trainings, things like OWASP events, like the one at AppSec DC. We do private corporate trainings all over the globe. And I've spent a lot of energy asking the question, what can go wrong in training, so that I can do something about it. And I believe that we offer amazingly good training. Also have some books, Threat Modeling, Designing for Security, and Threats, What Every Engineer Should Learn from Star Wars, came out of the training. When people asked me, where do I go to learn more about these threats? And so we've got a lot of inexpensive resources. We've got a lot of fast trainings. We've got some in-depth trainings. So yes, please come talk to me via my website at showstack.org.
I share the
And
games and
love to help
trainings and
people with this
books.
stuff.
Yes. And follow him on social media too. So you can follow him on Twitter. You can follow him on
No,
LinkedIn.
don't follow me on Twitter. I'm off Twitter. I'm on Mastodon.
Mastodon.
Adam
Okay. So,
Showstack at infosec.exchange.
okay, perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. This has been so amazing. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for your amazing questions and participation. This has been so fantastic. I really, really appreciate all of you coming, especially from like all over the world where maybe the time zones are not ideal for you, like the folks in India. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
Oh, do you have any last things before I say goodbye to everyone?
just thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you all. We will see you next time. I'm going to send this recording to everyone. And thank you, Adam.